Hello and welcome to the first virtual debate between the top two candidates for the Democratic Party nomination for president. I am your host, Ari Head, and now let's meet the candidates. At the right podium is Mrs. Hillary Rodham Clinton, and at the left podium is Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. Viewers from around the country have submitted questions to ask the candidates, so let's get started. Our first question comes from Frankie in Long Island, New York, about the Keystone XL pipeline. The Keystone XL pipeline would pipe oil from Canadian tar sands deposits in Canada down to ports in the Gulf to be sold mostly to countries overseas. The pipeline was proposed many years ago and was approved by the State Department when Mrs. Clinton was Secretary of State. So, Mrs. Clinton, Frankie wants to know if you now support the Keystone XL pipeline.
Well, as you know, I was the Secretary of State who started that process. I was the one who put into place the investigation. I have now passed it off as obvious, because I'm no longer there, to Secretary Kerry. This is President Obama's decision, and I am not going to second-guess him because I was in a position to set this in motion, and I do not think that would be the right thing to do. So I want to wait and see what he and Secretary Kerry decide. If it's undecided when I become president, I will answer your question.
You mean if you become president, then you'll tell us what your position is on this. Senator Sanders, what are your comments on this issue?
When people tell you that Keystone is a jobs program, they're not telling you the truth. According to the State Department, it will create about 2,000 jobs, construction jobs, over a 2-year period, and then about 50 permanent jobs. If you want a jobs program, let's rebuild our crumbling infrastructure, invest $1 trillion in doing that, and create 13 million jobs, not 2,000 jobs.
I think it's a good idea for the President, Congress, and the American people to listen to the overwhelming amount of scientists who tell us loudly and clearly that climate change is one of the great planetary crises that we face, and that it is absolutely imperative. This is not Bernie Sanders. This is the scientific community who tell us that climate change is real. It is caused by human activity, the emission of carbon, that it is already causing devastating problems on this planet in terms of drought and flood and extreme weather disturbances. And unless we get our act together, the planet that we're going to be leaving to our kids and grandchildren is going to be significantly less habitable than the planet that we have right now. So we have got to reverse climate change. We have to cut carbon, and the idea of going to an area and allowing for increased exploration of some of the dirtiest oil on the planet, to me, makes no sense at all.
Well, that sounds like a no. Our next issue comes from Pierre in Red Stick, Louisiana. And Pierre wants to know about Wall Street's too-big-to-fail banks and provisions of the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act was passed after the 1929 Wall Street crash. It prohibited commercial banks with federally insured deposits from merging with investment banks and insurance companies, because if one of those entities failed, it could bring down the whole conglomerate, and that would leave the taxpayers on the hook for a lot of money in those insured deposit accounts. In 1999, President Bill Clinton signed legislation that repealed those provisions of the Glass-Steagall Act. So do either of you support reinstatement of the provisions of Glass-Steagall? Mrs. Clinton, let's start with you.
I think this is a much more complicated issue than to just point at any one piece of legislation and say if we just pass that, everything would be fine. I think our first goal has to be to implement fully and effectively Dodd-Frank. Let's fully take stock of where the banks are today, because I am not interested in just saying there's one answer to the too-big-to-fail problem. We have a too-big-to-fail problem still, and we have to figure out the best way to address it, and I will be talking more about that. But I am not going to be, pointing at any one change and saying, that'll solve all our problems, because I just don't think that is an accurate assessment.
Senator Sanders, your comments on this.
I voted for the Dodd-Frank legislation, but let us not kid ourselves. Dodd-Frank was a modest piece of legislation. Dodd-Frank did not end much of the casino-style gambling that takes place on Wall Street.
In fact, much of this reckless activity is still going on today. As we all know, the greed, recklessness, and illegal behavior on Wall Street drove this country into the worst recession since the Great Depression. No single financial institution should be so large that its failure would cause catastrophic risk to millions of Americans or to our nation's economic well-being. The bill that I am introducing today with Congressman Brad Sherman would require regulators at the Financial Stability Oversight Council to establish too big to fail list of financial institutions and other huge entities whose failure would pose a catastrophic risk on the United States economy without a taxpayer bailout. This list must include, but is not limited to, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, and Morgan Stanley. Within a year, the Treasury Secretary would be required to break up financial institutions on this list so that they cannot cause another financial crisis. Importantly, under this bill, none of the institutions on the too big to fail list would be able to receive a taxpayer bailout from the Federal Reserve, nor could they gamble with the federally insured bank deposits of the American people while they are on that list. For me, this position that I'm holding today is not new. In 1999, I helped lead the opposition against repealing Glass-Steagall that allowed commercial banks, insurance companies, and investment banks to merge. If an institution is too big to fail, it is too big to exist, and that is the bottom line.
And that concludes round one of this virtual debate between the top two contenders for the Democratic Party nomination for President 2016. We'll be back with more issues after this break.